Hi, Rabbi Skolnik here, and I'm delighted to have a chance to share Torah with you on Parashat Vaye'shev, which will be our Torah reading this coming Shabbat morning on December 17, I believe. So Parashat Vaye'shev is a transitional Parsha that brings us into the narrative that's going to take us all the way to the end of the book of Genesis, to the book of Breshit. And we learn this actually in the second verse of the Parasha in a fascinating way. It says in the first verse that Yaakov lived, or he dwelt, in the ancestral homeland of his fathers in the land of Canaan. And then in the second verse, we read the words, Ele toldot Yaakov, Yosef ben Shva Esrei Shana Haya. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph was 17 years old. And it proceeds to tell the story of Joseph and his brothers. I love that verse. I've always thought that that verse is such a window onto reality. All of us who are parents know that somewhere in our lives there comes that moment. You can't always tag it exactly, but there comes a moment where our story becomes the story of our children. And Yaakov was a man of saga. God knows he had a fascinating life going all the way back to the beginning. His struggle with Esav and the inheritance that he got spiritually, materially from his family, that always came via dissension and strife, but he's the bearer of that legacy. And we just finished reading about his dramatic re-encounter with Esav after 20 years, and how terrified he was that it was going to go badly. And the opening verse of the Torah says, okay, all that's over, and now Yaakov he's dwelling in the land of his ancestors. And that's the moment in Yaakov's life where it transitions into being the story of his children. He is, for all intents and purposes, a single parent. And he segues now into having to deal full-time with 12 really obstreperous kids who are going to become, literally and figuratively, Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, which is Yaakov's other name. It got changed last week. But somehow or other, his life is going to be defined by what happens with his children. And that's something that many of us experience. And then, again, when our children leave our homes and we empty nest, as it were, we try to reclaim what our life is about without our children. It's a great challenge. That's one thought. A second item, you can't read Parashat Vaye'shev without thinking about the idea of learned behaviors. No one in Genesis, before this Torah reading, is more the victim of favoritism among parents than is Yaakov, with the arguable exception of his brother Esav. The two of them suffer for the fact that the mother figure there, Rivka, loves Esav, the father, Yitzchak, loves Yaakov, and all kinds of terrible things happen as a result of the parents playing favorites. You would think that Yaakov, who was one of the victims of this behavior, would figure out, when he was able to have his own family, that what his parents did to him is not a good thing, and that visiting the sins of the parents upon the children is not the road to go. But we learn immediately at the beginning of this Parsha what we all know, if only by Andrew Lloyd Webber, right? That Yaakov loves Yosef more than the other sons. The Torah says because he was a ben skunim. He was a child of old age. But that's a weak excuse, really. For whatever reason, he loved Yosef. He was good looking. He was talented. He was obviously brighter And Yaakov just thought that he was the best of his offspring. And lo and behold, as a result of his favoritism and the coat of many colors, the whole story of Joseph and his brothers ensues. And if you really want to carry it through to its logical conclusion, the Israelites wind up in Egypt because Jacob favored Joseph. They get dragged down to Egypt willy-nilly once Yosef's true identity is revealed. Number 3, the idea of midah keneged midah, measure for measure. If you read Genesis carefully, you can't help but notice that what we in conventionary literary criticism would call poetic justice is a force that is at play in the book. Yaakov, as his name implies, is a deceiver. He, as much as any other character, engages in deception. You can argue that it wasn't his initiative, but he engages in deception at his mother's behest, and even when he himself is negotiating with Esav over that fated bowl of soup, he's not truthful all the time. Think of someone in that book who suffers more from people being not truthful with him than Yaakov. The first thing that happens to him when he leaves his parents' home running away from his brother is that he meets up with his father-in-law-to-be, who lies through his teeth. He falls in love with Rachel, Yaakov, and Lavan says, work for me for 7 years and I'll give you Rachel. Then he works for him, and then Lavan says, only kidding, because I can't give the younger sister before the older sister. He has to work for another 7 years. And Lavan, who is a big-time deceiver, toys with Yaakov and makes him the victim of his untruths. But the really sad and pathetic poetic justice in this book is that the biggest lie that's told to Yaakov is told to him by his own sons in the cruelest possible way. When they dip Joseph's coat of many colors in an animal's blood, and they bring it back to Yaakov, and they say, Tarof Toraf Yosef. Yosef was torn apart by a wild animal. And this is Yaakov. He's an old man, his favorite child. He has to have all of these mental images of his son literally being torn apart by an animal. And your heart goes out to him, but on a larger scale, what is being done to him is a version of what he did to others. Maybe not quite as cruelly, but he is a victim of untruth his entire life. Last but not least, Joseph. We're going to have a chance to talk about Joseph for a few weeks, but just a moment about Joseph. He is, in a literary sense, the hero of this story. By that I mean, he's the protagonist, he's the center, he's the moral center in some ways, he's the action center. All of the action in the story revolves around Yosef. So far, what we know about him is that he's good looking. We also know from this week's Parsha that even though he lords it over his brothers and he torments them with his visions of how grand he's going to be, they're all going to bow down to him, at least in the end of the Parsha, he shows himself to have a strong moral core by refusing to sleep with Potiphar's wife, who is trying really hard to seduce him in every way that she could think of, but Joseph refuses. I think it's a great paradigm for us, as is the entire book, really, of the fact that in families, we rarely find perfect characters. Parents aren't perfect. Children aren't perfect. In-laws aren't perfect. No one's perfect in these stories. And even the heroic figures have serious flaws. In that way, more so than any other book in the Bible, Genesis serves for us as a paradigm of what reality is in family life. It teaches us that our children and our parents and the people that we love the most are capable of being fine and good and worthy children and parents, even if they disappoint us occasionally, even if they are possessing of faults that can vex us. They're still capable of love, they're still capable of devotion, and they're still worthy of respect. Shabbat Shalom.